5 or 6 years, there has been an effort to organize vulnerabilities into some kind of taxonomy so that you can understand the types of mistakes that are commonly made, and hopefully that will help you, avoid them if you are a programmer, or if you are security analyst, then that gives you a place to sort of look at and understand the vulnerability reports, right? Because there are these so CVEs, right, which are a way of enumerating common vulnerabilities, right? So this is how vulnerabilities get reported. Right? If somebody reports a vulnerability, it gets assigned a number, and that's called the CVE number. And then there is some vetting of that vulnerability, and then the CVE is published. So you can, NIST keeps a database of these vulnerabilities called National Vulnerability Database. It has a nice interface, and you can query vulnerabilities based on their type. Okay, and then you can sort of see, okay, what kind of vulnerabilities are most common these days. So CVEs have been around for a very long time, and probably this effort started in the 90s. Okay, but CVEs are just, they are not very helpful to understand the landscape or what are the types of problems that happen. It's not very helpful because it just tells you instances of a problem, right? So it could be like a million buffer overflow problems, right? And just looking at a million of them doesn't necessarily help, because all you need to know is that it is a particular type of a buffer overflow. So for that, they came out with this common weakness enumeration, which tells you more about the vulnerability, and rather explains the vulnerability in terms of the underlying software problem, rather than the fact that this exists in a particular version of a particular software. Okay, and then if you want to understand what are the most common ones that I should be aware of, then they have something like a top 25. So you can look at that top 25 and see, okay, what are these most common types of vulnerabilities. Okay, so many of the ones that we discussed, they are among this top 25. So all the injection vulnerabilities, buffer overflows, and so on. So input validation is a general big class of vulnerabilities. Another category that is identified is what is called failure to recognize or enforce trust boundaries. Right? So there exists this, there may be a function that assumes its input is benign, right? There is no attack. And if you are writing another application which accepts untrusted input, and you call this function which believes its input is benign with untrusted input, then obviously bad things can happen, right? So that's what is meant by enforcing trust boundaries, right? So if the function trusts its input, don't call it with untrusted input, right? So that's, and you can see that is can cause some of these problems, right? So why do you have a SQL injection attack? Because there is a function that allows you to do a SQL query, and this function assumes that the input is benign, right? You trust the input. Now, if you construct a query string from untrusted input and call this function, well, why are you surprised things don't work the way you expect, right? So you need to. So one of the things that when you go through a security class, you sort of have this. You need to think about the threat model. You have to keep it in mind all the time and figure out, okay, have I at this point, this piece of input, is it something that I trust or not, right? And then do the right thing based on whether you trust it or not. So another class of mistakes that's very commonly made is, you forget to do something, right? This is so, generic, right? So you forget that you forgot that you didn't perform authentication. Well, that's probably not that likely, right? So you will do authentication. But what you may forget is that there was, some credentials that you set up for debugging purposes, right? And then it's been there for a long time, and then you forgot that it is there, and then this debug credentials can be used after you, deploy the software in the field. Okay. So another, so you can be missing authentication, or you may be missing authorization. Authorization means that whether a particular operation is permitted or not. Okay. So authentication means you're checking whether the request comes from somebody who has been verified, right? So it's more about verifying the identity of the entity that's asking for a service. Authorization is, yes, you may have performed authentication. That still doesn't mean that this person is authorized to do something, right? So for instance, you might have, if you have a web server, the web server might authenticate users, and for authenticated users, it may allow them to view certain pages, but maybe it doesn't want these users to write or replace those pages. Okay, so you have to check what permission is being used and whether that is. And there are a number of other problems, and rather than going through them now, we will look at many of these problems throughout the course. Right? So, for instance, when we talk about how to perform authentication, we will see what are these, what are safe hash functions, and which hash functions can you use, and what is the salt, and all of that, and how you could make mistakes in selecting all of that. Okay, so we will do that when we get there. So there is, a number of other problems like weak random numbers, which again we'll see later on in the course. Information leakage, well, we have seen this. That's what you're trying to use in your assignment, right? So because the application doesn't check whether the input is benign or whether the input is causing it to leak information that creates vulnerabilities. Over permissioning is another common source of problem. Right? So you have an application that is given too many privileges, then it becomes a right target for attackers, right? Because if it has too many privileges, that's the one the attacker is going to target. So then by abusing this application's privileges, then the attacker can elevate their own privilege. Okay. Another interesting thing to think about is that, especially in complex pieces of software, there is a lot of code that is there to deal with errors and exceptions, right? So because you don't want to crash as soon as something unusual happens. So you have a lot of code for checking errors and recovering from them. But errors are rare. So this error checking code is often not as thoroughly tested as the normal code paths that are exercised when nothing is going wrong, right? So very often what happens is that attackers find vulnerabilities in these error handling code, because that's the one that hasn't been fully tested. Right? It's just very difficult to test. How do you have to inject errors, simulate errors somehow, right? And it's quite difficult to create every possible error to check every possible code path in your program, right? So there are many more. If you want to go from CW25 to CW25 to CW8000, well, that's there too. Okay, so I'm not going to give you sort of a cookbook for how to write secure code. The hope is that when we look at many of these attacks and examples, that tells you the things to avoid, right? And the reason why we don't give you a cookbook is because it's a little difficult to give you a complete cookbook, right? I would rather give you many examples and have you develop a sense of, how does the attacker think, and then how can I make sure that, I write my code in such a way that it is more robust, right, against attacks. So again, there are these but you can definitely see on the web there is this is about web applications and how to write secure code. There are coding standards for C and C++ and Java, and there are the top 10s and so on. So you can look these up at your own leisure. So let me conclude by talking about this principles of secure system design, which is from this paper from 1975. So so how many of you, does anybody know where the name Unix came from? Yeah.
Sort of like a plan was against the older system Multics.
Right. So these people, worked on Multics, and that's sort of where, people understood how to do security. A number of security principles were developed in that Multics project, but because they were trying to build something very general, it ended up being too complex and impractical. And so, two researchers one day said, this is not going to work. I'm going to go off on my own and build a simple operating system, and that's how Unix came about. Right? So, but the interesting thing is that the principles that were developed in that paper is pretty much all we talk about even today, right? I mean, because everything we have, all the guidelines and so on that we give today for secure coding can trace their origin to this list of principles. Okay. So I'll quickly go through this, and then we'll come back to this at some point. Okay. So because it's easy for me to just say what this means, but words don't mean anything until you sort of really understand the meaning behind them. So economy of mechanism simply says that anything complicated won't be secure, right? And you can because once again I told you about error cases and error handling. Things get very complicated, and once things are very complicated, nobody understands exactly what this piece of code is going to do, and so there are parts of it that nobody understands, and it is those parts that the attacker is going to exploit. So simplicity is the basis of having confidence. So assurance is about confidence. So for you to have confidence that some system is secure, it has to be simple. Okay, and this is why, for instance, a lot of people just put, you block out your, camera on your laptop with a, piece of paper, right? Because you know that's a simple mechanism that's going to work, right? It's not based on some, 100,000 lines of code in the middle that may or may not be correct. So fail-safe defaults means, default deny, right? So when in doubt, say no, right? This is a very important principle in security, but a principle that we find it extremely hard to follow, right? Because in the real world, when we deny, people call us and hound us. And so our goal is, we end up doing exact opposite, right? So we say, if you want to deny, be really sure. And but that's unfortunately doesn't work. And as a result, there are most systems are, over permissioned. They allow a lot more things than they should, and that is why when they are exploited, right? Once you find an exploit, then because that application has a lot of privilege, and you're able to abuse that privilege once you have an exploit on that application, right? So if there was if it was built with fail-safe defaults, then things would be much better. So complete mediation is another extremely important principle, and what it says is that you need to make sure that every path to access a resource is checked, right? This is like if you have your home, you put a big lock on the front door and and leave the side door open, right? So this is not going to make your home secure. So complete mediation basically says, make sure that every access to a resource is checked. Okay? And this is a lot of security problems come because complete mediation is not ensured. Open design says no security by obscurity, right? So don't try to don't think that your system can be made more secure by not documenting it or by making protecting the source code or encrypting the source code or whatever, right? Because what ends up happening with security by obscurity is, once again, the vulnerabilities are, nobody understands what vulnerabilities might exist. Nobody examines whether there might be vulnerabilities, and as such, it's a lot more likely that vulnerabilities will be left behind. Okay? So that's why we should avoid it. So let's stop here and